Now, yesterday, we were treated to an utter disgrace of a performance in Glastonbury by a person who until now, I'd actually never heard of, Bob Vylan, who thought it was OK to incite violence, which I thought was against the law, on stage, broadcast to some 20 million people on the BBC.
Free, free! Free, free! Alright, but have you heard this one, though? Death, death to the IDF! Death, death to the IDF! Death, death to the IDF! Death, death to the IDF!
Lucy Connolly is currently in prison for a tweet where she called for asylum hotels to be set on fire. You could argue that Bob Vylan, what he has done, is the same but far worse. A, because inciting death to the IDF could be seen as anti-Semitic, which is pretty much racism. And B, because chanting for the death of people, which the IDF is made up of, is incitement to violence. So what's the difference? And it's completely unhelpful when ministers come up with this. Wes Streeting on Sky News earlier.
I'd also say to the Israeli embassy, get your own house in order in terms of the conduct of your own citizens and the settlers in the West Bank. You know, I think there's a serious point there by the Israeli embassy I take seriously. I wish they'd take the violence of their own citizens towards Palestinians more seriously. We all condemned and continue to condemn what happened on October the 7th. We all want to see the return of the hostages, and there's no justification for inciting violence against Israelis.
All right.
But, you know, the way in which Israel's conducting this war has made it extremely difficult for Israel's allies around the world to stand by and justify. In fact, we've got to do the opposite as an international community, which is to challenge and urge a change of course.
So basically, instead of outright condemnation, Wes has, in my view, inadvertently tried to justify the outburst by bringing in other variables that appear to act as some sort of reasoning or justification as to why someone might feel the way Bob Vylan does. That is actually irrelevant, especially when you consider the hate-fueled environment Bob Vylan created at Glastonbury.
Death, death to the IDF! Death, death to the IDF!
Whereas no one should be allowed to call publicly for the death of people and for that to be broadcast on TV. If Lucy Connolly is in prison for her tweet, then what I expect to hear from you, Wes, is laser-like focus on the crime in hand, which is, in my view, incitement to violence on British soil towards people in another country fighting a war, not find them some form of, in my view, justification or criticism of Israel. And when you consider the hateful rhetoric that accompanied the outbreak, I'd expect Wes to outwardly condemn the whole affair and deal with the situation in hand, no matter what he thinks personally. I'm pretty sure that incitement to violence is against the law. So stick with the programme, Wes. Your additional comments only are set to inflame the situation. Why are you bringing in the West Bank? This is completely unhelpful. There is no excuse for incitement to violence or racial hatred, as you well know, that you did make clear on GB News earlier. The organisers have condemned Bob Vylan, saying that a post on Instagram said, as a festival, we stand against all forms of war and terrorism. We will always believe in and actively campaign for hope, unity, peace and love. With almost 4,000 performances at Glastonbury 2025, there will inevitably be artists and speakers appearing on our stages whose views we do not share, and a performer's presence here should never be seen as a tacit endorsement of their opinions and beliefs. And as for the BBC, well, they have some questions to answer. A spokesperson said some of the comments made during Bob Vylan's performance were deeply offensive during this live stream on iPlayer, which reflected what was happening on stage. A warning was issued on screen about the very strong and discriminatory language. We have no plans to make the performance available on demand. So they put a warning up. Can you imagine if GB News had broadcast that? We'd be reported to Ofcom and then swiftly taken off air, never to broadcast again. On GB News, Health Secretary Wes Streeting condemned the remarks, but stopped short of calling for the BBC Director General Tim Davies' resignation.
The BBC have got questions to answer, as of the organisers of Glastonbury, about how this particular act came to be given such a prominent platform.
And this seemed to be echoed by Work and Pension Secretary Helen Whatley.
Can't believe that the BBC continued to show it. I think they've got questions to answer as to how did that happen.
Meanwhile, Israel's Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, Sharon Haskell, was not impressed by the events.
I just don't understand how chants for death, for the destruction of Israel, racist comments like that have been just normalized in the UK.
Well, it will be interesting to see how the government react, if at all. Before we get stuck into the debate, here's what else is coming up today. Glastonbury and the BBC say they are appalled by the statements made by rap punk duo Bob Vylan as they called for Israeli soldiers to die. But is it too little too late? In the Great British Debate, I'm asking, is Nigel Farage a good role model for young men? Reform UK's leader says that he hopes the youth will look up to him, not Andrew Tate. Then, for the Great British Debate, I'm asking, should cannabis be upgraded to a Class A drug? More than a quarter of police crime commissioners say it's worse than heroin. But friend of the show, Sadiq Khan, thinks otherwise. Supermarkets will also be ordered to cut up to 100 calories from the average shopping basket under a new nanny state drive to tackle obesity. But should we reform the NHS rather than our shopping baskets? All of that on the way. As ever, send me your thoughts, post your comments, gbnews.com/your say. Well, we can now speak to political commentator James Matthewson. Hello, James. Thank you very much for joining me. Now, am I totally wrong with saying that in this instance, I don't think that talking about West Bank and other issues are really relevant at this moment, where Wes is specifically talking about the chanting and the rudeness and the awful hate-filled messages on stage?
I think you are wrong, Nana, unfortunately. It's entirely relevant. And it's entirely relevant because of the anger that exists, understandably, not just at Glastonbury, across our country, across every country in the world. Internationally, there is condemnation, outrage, and understandably great grievance with the actions of Israel. Now, of course, the chants that we heard from Bob Vylan there, who I also hadn't heard of until yesterday, by the way, but those chants of free, free Palestine, you know, absolutely fine. Death to the IDF. I understand the issue with that, I really do. But
yeah.
if your outrage is reserved for that, and for calling for the death of foreign military members from a foreign military,
who are protecting the Israeli people, yes. They are people.
You're more outraged about that than you are about the genocide itself, then I just don't understand how that can be the case.
Well, so what you're saying then is that's fair enough for them to say that because you believe that Israel is carrying out a genocide, when yet that is a war, and you haven't actually mentioned Hamas at all. You seem to be totally focused on. Well, what about Hamas? Well, what about Hamas? Well, you know, if you're going to say that if you're going to say that Israel are carrying out a genocide, well, what about Hamas? What about October the 7th? What about that? What about their behaviour?
Hamas are a terrorist organisation who committed an atrocity against Israel on October the 7th.
And have been firing rockets over to Israel well before that, trying to destroy Israel. So you are aware of all of that.
But if we're going to talk about things prior to October 7th...
Well, no, I'm just saying that you are aware that Hamas have been antagonising Israel for a very long time before October.
Yes, but we should also talk about how Hamas aren't the Palestinian people. They're a terrorist organisation.
Yes, but Hamas are the people who are currently at war against Israel. Okay. So Hamas are part of the equation. So if people are simply saying death to the IDF, then why should we? Who would be killing the IDF? Why should they be killed?
Death to the Israeli, the strongest condemnation imaginable, obviously calling for someone's death, of a
absolutely
foreign
unacceptable.
The Israeli Defence Force, who, by the way, the Israeli Defence Force, let's just recap, have murdered over 58,000 people, 80% of whom, it's been found by the UN Special Committee, by Amnesty International, were civilians. Women, children, civilians, innocent civilians. There is no other word for what Israel is facilitating in Gaza than a genocide.
It was interesting that you say that, but yet you, again, let us remind us that Hamas, who hide behind their civilian population and are continuing... Sorry. and are continuously firing rockets over to Israel. We are talking about them because they perpetrated the atrocities on October the 7th. And they're proxies of Iran. And I'm just wondering why nobody in that crowd was talking about Hamas, why they're saying free Palestine and all of that, and death to the IDF, instead of saying Hamas, return the hostages and stop killing your own people, stop antagonising the war.
Nana, because Israel is committing a genocide in real time, which we are all watching.
It is not a genocide. Israel could have Israel could have destroyed Gaza in a heartbeat if they wanted to commit a genocide. They are not committing a genocide. If Hamas would perhaps stop firing the rockets and return the hostages, which is what has been asked, which they refuse to do.
Yeah, because we're a terrorist group, Nana. Because we're a terrorist group. How are you going to get a terrorist group to do what you wanted to do?
And they are the government of Gaza. Yes.
They're not a proper government. Nobody recognises...
Well, you're saying they're not the proper government, but they are the government, whether they're proper or not in your eyes. They are the government of Gaza. So you think that Israel are just simply firing rockets over at Gaza willy-nilly to kill the people, no matter... And you don't think that Hamas should be mentioned at all?
You think it's just rockets, Nana? It's not rockets. It's IDF
do you think...
soldiers. Let me finish. It's IDF soldiers shooting civilians who are trying to access food at food depots for no reason whatsoever. It is ethnic cleansing.
That's not true.
Settlers moving into the region repeatedly.
Who reported that to you? That's not true. You also know.
It's ethnic cleansing. That's where your rage should be.
You also know, though, presumably, that Hamas use UNRWA and people like that to also be part of the atrocities. So, as you know, many members of UNRWA were arrested after October the 7th for being participants of it. 12 members of UNRWA, and Israel have identified that many of those supposedly bringing aid are actually there to again.
That's why they want to cut off.
They're not cutting off aid, and actually that's not true. They haven't cut off aid anyway. That's not even true. But they haven't cut off aid, so that's not even true.
How many more people do you need with restricted journalistic access to a region? How many people do you need before the UN Special Committee, right? The group that was set up in the wake of World War II by the Allied forces to try and stop genocides from happening again, have called this a genocide. Professors...
Yeah, but it's not being legally referred to as a genocide. No. There's some people who maybe have loyalties, I don't know, to Palestine, or maybe, I don't know, but it hasn't been... Sorry, let me finish, because I listened. But it hasn't been ruled as a genocide, and I don't think it is a genocide, actually. It's a war.
Who would you like to rule it?
It's a war. It's a war. Do you know how many people live in Gaza? There are millions of people in Gaza, right? So, whilst it is abhorrent that many people have died, a genocide would mean that would be the entire population being destroyed, and that's not what's happening, is it?
Okay. Right, so until...
Is that what's... No, not until, but you're calling it a genocide. What evidence? You don't have any evidence of that. You're just saying that because that's what you think. That's what you think. That's what you think.
National's investigation into it, the UN Special Committee's investigation into it.
The UN... Listen, I wouldn't take anything that the UN say. I wouldn't take anything that the UN is saying with regards to this.
You don't think that the UN...
not with regard to this. Not with regard to this. And this has not... This has not legally be called a genocide. So
by who? Who do you want to call it a genocide legally? Who would you expect to hear that from?
Well, perhaps the International Court of Justice.
What, the people who've put out an arrest warrant?
They haven't called it that, have they? They haven't called it that, though, have they? They haven't called it that. It's just you. It's just people like you calling it that when Israel are defending themselves. Why have they not released the hostages? Release the hostages.
Because they're a terrorist group. We're not here to answer for Hamas.
Exactly, and they are the government of Gaza. They are the government of Gaza. This is not right now. No, because they are the government of Gaza, and you're not listening. You're just shouting. They're the government of Gaza. October the 7th happened, and now Israel are retaliating after much
retaliating against children.
Against Hamas, who are the government of Gaza, and they need to stop firing the rockets.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so because Hamas, in your view, are full of children, you shouldn't fire the rockets. Return the hostages, James.
Over the top of you.
You have been throughout.
You're going to have to let me speak.
I do let you speak, but you're talking over me, so I sometimes have to talk over you to stop you. Final word to you.
Can I speak? Yeah, okay.
I've just said that.
The whole point is children are not in Hamas. Hamas is not made up of children. Why have children been killed? Why are children killed every single day in Gaza? Why are we getting reports from doctors who are leaving, British doctors, American doctors, doctors from all over the world who are leaving Gaza every week, who are saying they have never seen anything like it? They are seeing bullet holes in children, children who have been deliberately targeted by IDF soldiers, and yet your anger and your rage is directed at somebody who is calling for the IDF to be killed, a foreign military. You're more angry about words said at a music festival than you are about dead children and ethnic cleansing.
Can I just tell you something, James? Okay, let me tell you this. Apparently, Hamas are actually offering money to people if they're prepared to kill. Yes, that's right.
I'm sorry.
Hamas, listen, let me finish. No. Listen. Hamas is now offering cash to anyone who will kill a Palestinian person working for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. See, so not only are they prepared to kill the Israelis, they're also killing their own people. So a lot of those people who are dying, are being killed by Hamas. Are you aware of that?
Because they know better than the IDF.
In
Hamas
Gaza, no. All right, Jason, we'll leave it there if you're not prepared to accept that the genocide happening in Gaza is partially being caused by Hamas themselves. Not
it's
just.
A genocide.
No. If you're calling it that, the genocide that you are referring to, and I'm not admitting it, that's what you're referring to, is being caused by Hamas themselves. All right, thank you very much, James Mathewson.